Hi, everyone, and welcome to Talk Money with Extra Foundation's financial education webinar on appreciating diverse language and culture in financial education. I would like to open our session and clear the space for our conversation by acknowledging that I join this meeting from the beautiful land of the Kombumerri people and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their enduring connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I would also like to extend that respect to all Indigenous peoples across the vast lands of oceans and earth, and a special kia ora to our Maori friends and kia orana to our Cook Island friends. May you live long and have a fulfilling life. It may be of interest to you to know that it is the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples on Friday, and the focus is on protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact. If I can read you the supporting statement, it says that this theme recognizes that Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact are the best protectors of the forest. Where the collective rights to lands and territories are protected, the forests thrive alongside their societies. And not only is their survival crucial to the protection of our planet, but it is crucial to the protection of cultural and linguistic diversity. In today's hyper-connected world, the existence of Indigenous peoples in voluntary isolation and initial contact is a testament to the rich and complex tapestry of humanity, and it is a huge loss to our world if they cease to exist. So welcome to our session today, and feel free to say hi and type the lands you join us from in the Q&A chat. So my name is Dr. Tracey West, and I have been with Ecstra Foundation as a manager of the Talk Money program for 12 months. Before that, I was a university lecturer and researcher in finance, focusing on financial literacy, financial inclusion, and behavioral finance. I am pleased to now be focused on supporting the financial literacy needs of young people. The Talk Money program delivers free financial literacy workshops to schools, is run by external facilitators, and is extremely easy to book. We are also developing resources for teachers, which include a series of fact sheets. And last year, we had our inaugural Financial Literacy in Action Awards to support teachers and principals doing really great work related to financial literacy in the classroom. So there were 3 winners that each won $2,500 for their school. And keep up to date with by subscribing to our newsletter to find out when we will be opening submissions to our Financial Literacy in Action Awards at the end of this year for announcing winners in March 2025 that aligns with Global Money Week. And this webinar supports Ecstra Foundation's ongoing work in financial education. We aim to support and build capability for effective financial education in schools, workplaces, and community settings. We know from our activities that school students value the opportunity to learn about personal finance, to understand their roles, rights, and responsibilities when operating in financial contexts, including work, how the economic environment affects them, and to be equipped with the skills and tools to be enterprising. We also know that teachers and parents recognize the importance of preparing young people for their future. Ecstra Foundation supports a variety of community programs that assist migrant women or women escaping family violence to build their financial independence. And there are amazing stories in these organizations that deliver this support, that help women find their first job, receive their first income and pay packet, open their first bank account, and many other firsts. It's truly rewarding work and perhaps surprising to know and really understand the multitude of barriers that many people living in Australia face to get into a position where they feel like they have control over their finances. Not understanding the document you are signing, or poor access to internet, poor digital literacy, or poor access to physical banking services are good examples of how people are excluded. It is even more challenging to enter a system that focuses on individuals' money hoarding when your culture instills generosity and sharing and prioritizing other, which includes the entire ecosystem, people, flora, and fauna. We also know that there are many compounding challenges at the moment that amplify the importance of having financial knowledge, understanding skills, dispositions, and values to make informed, effective, and responsible consumer and financial decisions. The cost of living crisis, housing affordability, and scams are front of mind. So if we go to today's agenda, we intend, and I might welcome the presenters to the screen. We intend to explore the intersections of language, culture, and finance and gain some practical insights into how we can incorporate an appreciation for diverse languages and cultures into our financial education practice. This is especially important in the school curriculum as valuing culture, language, and beliefs of themselves and of others is a cross-curriculum priority to cultivate mutual respect. The curriculum values the histories, cultures, traditions, and languages of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders past and ongoing contributions to contemporary Australian society and culture. It also values our engagement with Asia. So I'd really like to welcome Associate Professor Carrie Bodle, Associate Professor Levon Blue, Professor Jodie Hunter, esteemed teacher Rosette Kerr, and Senior Lecturer Laura Deswan to our session today, and I really look forward to hearing all of their insights that they're going to share with us. And we are all accustomed to online meetings, but a gentle reminder to turn your microphones off and type your questions for the presenters and any audio issues in the chat. We will have Q&A after our two panel sessions have concluded, and you can ask questions via the Q&A chat. We will email registered participants with a link to the recording, including the slide deck, and you follow up with a certificate of participation if you need that for your professional development portfolio. Okay, so on to our first session on Indigenous cultures today. I am very pleased to introduce to you our first panel speakers. I am very grateful to Associate Professor Carrie Bodle, Associate Professor Levon Blue, and Professor Jodie Hunter for sharing their time and stories with us today on Indigenous cultural approaches to financial education. So Carrie, you're an Associate Professor at Griffith Uni, and throughout your career, you've empowered young Indigenous people to embrace business as a potential career, indigenize the traditional business education curriculum, and engage with Indigenous business owners to identify what financial literacy supports are needed. Can you tell us more about yourself and your work?
Yeah, thanks, Tracey, and hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you today. I've been with Griffith University first as a undergraduate, but that was in 1995, so I'm celebrating almost 30 years with Griffith. And it's been a personal journey. So my mum was born in Cherbourg, so I have connections with the Waka Waka Nation people out there. It's been very difficult to, say where I've actually come from, because when I've done all my tracing of history, it's really, been about locating where I feel the most connection to. So I've been on the Kumba lands for the past 35 years. So I do have a really strong connection to, to our local Gold Coast region and the Kumba people, because they've really welcomed me. So going through my journey is that once I started my degree and really about finding my own culture, I noticed through the business curriculum that there was really nothing about Indigenous business or Indigenous people. It's not something that I really took a lot of note of, but it was just something that was just stuck in the back of my head, how I was going to, sort of do something with it later, not knowing. After finishing a PhD in accounting, I was invited to think about going on and start creating an Indigenous business course. And that was really what put a fire in my belly about, this is why, something that I think was meant for me to do. Together with that and putting in an ARC grant and going out and doing a 4-year project on financial literacy, has really been, a great journey in terms of, what we need to know is go to ground and make sure that we actually are talking to the right people. The methodology being a bottom-up approach of, look at what we've got and where the problems are. What are the voices of our communities talking about? And so, like I've really been strong on identifying why Indigenous culture is important in our business and financial literacy curriculum. I know that, obviously in high school and elsewhere, there is, starting to do a little bit more work, but there's still a lot of gaps. So my really passion was about, every student that goes through our business curriculum, when they come out as graduates, that they do get that Indigenous experience. So we've developed a Bachelor of Business that all our foundation courses do embed the ideas of why we are different, that we think differently. So some of the areas is, about our consideration of money, our savings. Aboriginal and Indigenous people do think differently. And if I can share just one example from the research when I was out on country, maybe it'll go into one or two, but like when I went into a shop and I was interviewing one of the business owners, and they had some of the young kids coming in after school, and they were just handing out the leftover sandwiches for that day, and what they said to the kids was, "Have you been to school? Because if you haven't been to school, you don't get any of the leftover sandwiches." I said to the business owner, I said, "Well, how do you account for that?" And she says, "Oh, I don't." She said, "That's just what mob do. We make sure that if we, give our kids our leftovers, they're going to be thrown out anyway." So I said, "Well, you can actually account for that into your accounting." And she was very, very appreciative of that. And even going back into developing curriculum, if you want to change the slide, Tracy. It was really about embedding not only the experiences, but looking at how do we talk about the case studies, the real things. So what I did was that I actually thought about how do I personally, has the previous government policies and practices affected my family, like the stolen generation, taking our wages, the stolen wages, and embed that all into the curriculum. And so, long story short, we, got through a few years, and we've now got an award. Well, I've got the award for the Australian University Teacher for the Neville Bonner Education Award. And that is really as a testament to all the people that I've worked with in the team that have made this happen. Because without them, you can't do this on your own. Next slide. So, in short, it's all about, and the way that I've adapted the curriculum into the Indigenous content into the curriculum is using storytelling. And I think if we can be, able to personalize what we're trying to teach, I think that makes a lot more sense to anyone that we're trying to engage with. So, it's not about the content, because when we start developing curriculum, we know we've got a certain amount of syllabus that we have to get through as teachers, but we also have to consider who are our clients, who are the people out there, how do they engage, how do they learn. So, we've got to look for, and I know for me, when I started teaching, I had a lot of international students, and I could see them processing, having to interpret, their language and everything that I said. So we need to know who is in front of in our classroom. Are they right brain thinkers, left brain thinkers? Do they think with symbols and pictures, or are they very, mathematical minded? If they're not, how do we reach them? Anyway, when I was out on country, I went up to see Auntie Miriam Rose Ongara, who was one of our Australians of the Year, and I met with her, and we took out some gifts to her. And when after speaking to her, I said to her, is there anything that we can do for you once we get back to to our area, that we can send out to you? Anything we can do? And she said Lego. And I said, well, Lego, she said, yeah, we actually use it for our kids for learning about accounting, not accounting, but maths and numbers and things like that. So the colors and the shapes and things like, so you can see that, you know, we've got to embed that with our curriculum and really try and reach those that learn differently. So next slide. So something that's come through with one of the, we've developed a curriculum competency and framework for our embedding throughout the whole of the university-wide approach of embedding Indigenous knowledge. And this is one of the slides that came through, and we were going to adapt it to our implementation. So there is a reference there that anyone can have a look at. But basically what we're doing is that we need to know that we include a co-design. So we're going back to the elders, we're looking at who and where we're situated so we can really talk to country. You know, it has to be place-based. We have to look at, you know, how do we engage and control our biases and our assumptions. You know, we look at micro and managing positions of Indigenous people. You know, we're sharing our knowledges and across the board so that we can actually make sure that we are, you know, across everybody and every level of the university, not just in business, but I think, you know, being able to understand our, you know, especially the financial literacy side of things. So that's me for my presentation, but thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Carrie. I really appreciate that. I think the themes of record keeping, it's an important skill to build, and storytelling, I think might be a theme that keeps coming up of ways to engage students and transfer information to start with a story and then take out the key concepts from there and then build the content concepts around the story. So now I'd like to pass over to Livon, who is Associate Professor at the University of Queensland. Livon is a member of the Busolil First Nation in Canada and has written extensively on how individual wealth accumulation practices promoted in conventional financial literacy education collide with Indigenous ways of being, knowing, and doing. Livon, please share your experience in this space and how do we best present both approaches in the classroom?
Thank you. Thank you, Tracey, for inviting me. And thank you, Carrie, for sharing your insights. Just so you know, Carrie and I have worked together probably for about a decade now, including the research project that she spoke about. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners for the lands where I'm coming from, and that's Turrbal and Yagara peoples. I pay my respects to elders past and present and recognize that sovereignty has never been ceded. As a protocol in Australia, and it is also a protocol in Canada, when you're introducing yourself to Indigenous people, you need to locate yourself. I won't go through all of that detail, but I'll just do a little bit. Nimki Nebuke, Wabshoshan Dadan. My name is Livon Blue. I'm a member of the Bosley First Nations in Canada, and I was taught to introduce myself in Ojibwe when meeting Indigenous people from around the world. My First Nation heritage comes from my dad and my grandmother and my great-grandparents. My great-grandfather was once the chief of the community where I'm a member of. And despite being in Australia for 20 plus years, I still hold very close connections to the community I'm from. I hold a member trustee role there because the community has 2 trust agreements from land claim settlements against the Canadian government. So now I'll just share a little bit about the research that I've done. My PhD focused on the financial literacy education practices in a First Nation community in Canada. And from that research, I learned about the importance of what Stephen Chemist, Emeritus Professor Stephen Chemist et al. Refer to as site-specific learning and a needs-based approach to financial education. So although my PhD commenced more than a decade ago, back then financial education was very much a one-size-fits-all approach. And so whether I was in Australia or Canada, there was likely a binder sitting on a shelf from a financial literacy workshop that had taken place, and you would find a section on learning how to budget, setting goals, planning for the future, needs versus wants, those sorts of things. Not that there's anything wrong with those skill sets, but it often came from a deficit perspective of this is what you need. And there was an assumption that Indigenous peoples or anyone who was not experiencing financial well-being could be fixed by learning or acquiring these financial skills that they were assumed to be lacking. And not realizing that there is research showing that individuals who are living on low incomes are often very savvy budgeters because it is in fact a life skill. So instead, when working with First Nations people, I would first find out what they were interested in with regards to financial education. And the work I've done in Canada was around learning how to read financial statements. As I mentioned, we have trust accounts within that particular community. And it was important to develop education that was site-specific to these trusts so that we could connect planning and expenditure and financial decision-making that would cover the next 7 generations, which is culturally significant. Also, learning how to read financial statements was also a way to create agency in a financial context so that community members were quite comfortable questioning and asking questions of financial professionals. Often financial professionals working in First Nations communities aren't community members, and sometimes they're not Indigenous, and there is a risk of exploitation. I don't have time to get into that at the moment. So I would work with young people from a First Nations community to develop these sorts of resources and to pitch it appropriately. We also worked together on another activity, which was around budgeting and planning, but it was a little bit gamified. And what I mean by that is it was a high school group that attended a youth group after school. And they all lived on an island. So to attend college or university, they needed to leave the community. So the examples I'm giving, you're probably noticing that there's nothing particularly Indigenous about the activities, but rather it's a needs-based approach that is quite site-specific and relevant. So I needed to learn about the community's policies and allowance with regards to leaving the community and going to school, because we have treaties, so there are educational allowances that come with that. Needed to be aware of those policies. And so the students then worked with a monthly allocation that they were informed about, and I got them to do some research about where they wanted to live. It was going to be on campus, on their own, with other people. Would they have their own vehicle? Would they be reliant on public transport? All sorts of things that they had to do some prior research on. Then I worked with them to develop these budgets, and then we would introduce what we called wild card, and a student would then select some unknown card. And when it turned over, it had some sort of event that was taking place that was going to involve some sort of financial expenditure. So for example, your friend announces that they're engaged and you've been invited to come back to the community to celebrate at the engagement party. And so they had to decide with their budget that they'd allocated whether they'd come back and attend the event or if they're going to make some adjustments, or sometimes they'd say, oh, I'll just call grandma and see if grandma will help. So we did that sort of thing, and that was very much connected to it was age appropriate and connected to what takes place in that community. I do have an example from within a classroom. So it was a year 4 classroom in Australia. And I think it's a fabulous example of what Professor Thomas Lucy and colleagues would call a compassionate approach to financial literacy. So it was an inquiry-based mathematics lesson. The students were working in small groups of 3 to 4, and they were tasked with deciding on what the best fundraising option was for the school. They also had the importance of building positive learning identities within mathematics built around it, because Professor Katie Mucker from the University of Queensland and Professor Mia O'Brien, who was then at Griffith University, were involved in this project. This was their ARC project. So I don't have a lot of time to go through everything, but some of the findings and the links on this page point you to the paper I just discussed, and the bottom one is the one I'm discussing now. Some of the highlights were that the year 4 students, and I was the researcher, so I was in there with the film camera, just listening, not saying anything, to what was going on. And the students seriously considered the impact of financial decisions on others. They were really concerned about repaying their ability to repay a loan to the school. It was a loan of $400 that was available to purchase supplies. They also made decisions about what to sell based on what would appeal to the whole family rather than just the students. And they also made decisions around what a fair price would be so that the majority of families could attend and participate in this event rather than just focusing on the highest profit. And that also reminds me of another example from my PhD research. I'm sure many of you have attended a charity auction. This auction that I attended was run a little bit differently, and I'll just give you a little insight to it. It was to support a community member who was in hospital for some time in the city, so they were away from their community. And this auction was called a loonie auction. In Canada, the $1 coin has a loon on it, a bird. And so how you participated in this was all the items were donated, which is common practice. But then let's say you were interested in this item, maybe it's a new pair of shoes or something like that, I don't know. You would purchase tickets from the runner. So you might want to come to this community event and be social, but you might only have $10 on you. Well, you could choose then what item you want to bid on, and the entry point was $1 for 3 tickets. And so that meant that it wasn't about being cut out by having to have the highest bid. Basically, you could increase your chances of getting it by buying more tickets, but you could also stay within your own budget and enjoy the social event within the community. So I hope those examples give you some good ideas about site-specific, needs-based financial education that sort of comes from more of a compassionate place. And on the next slide, if you're not already familiar, I just want to point you to 2 people who you'd probably like to look at their resources. Professor Chris Matthews, who is the CEO of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Mathematics Alliance, ATSIMA. They have, if you go to their website, there are resources that have been developed for mathematics classrooms that bring in Indigenous perspectives. And Dr. Carly Sawatsky, who is a teacher educator, researcher from Deakin University, and Carly and her team have worked on a number of resources around building financial capabilities in classrooms. So there's links to those resources as well. Thank you.
That's really fabulous, Levon, and so many good examples there, especially highlighting the importance of asking students and people in your community what they need to know, what they're interested in knowing, and then how to go about that. And I really love the wildcard example in that budgeting activity, because most of the time we do budgeting in a classroom as a static exercise, whereas I do think we need to be flexible and reflective to emerging news and events. So I really love that. Well, thanks, Levon. I will now introduce Professor Jodie Hunter. So Jodie is a professor at the Institute of Education at Massey University and teaches mathematics and Pacifica education. She focuses on culturally responsive teaching for Pacifica learners that consider their cultural, linguistic, and social contexts. So Jodie, please tell us a bit more about yourself and what you've been working on.
Oh, kia rana. So just to introduce myself, I'm a Cook Island New Zealander. So my grandmother was born on a tiny island in the Cook Islands called Manahiki and came to New Zealand as a teenager. So I myself was born in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but a lot of my work has been focused on working with Pacific communities, both in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also in the Pacific Islands, to examine the kinds of funds of knowledge and experiences that they have related to mathematics and also related to financial experiences more recently. So one of the key reasons for this work and what I'll be talking about today is that in the context of mathematics education, a lot of my work has been in mathematics education and then moved into financial education as well. But working with Pacific students, and I know that you have a lot of Pacific students in different parts of Australia as well, when we interviewed children and also families and talk about how they see their culture related to mathematics. And the same goes for financial situations. A lot of the time, children aren't able to see within the mathematics classroom or within financial education how the typical classroom experiences that they have in school are related to themselves and their culture. That makes sense. So that means that often children will say things that they can't really see the connections between the financial education that's being presented at school and the things that they learn and the experiences that they have at home. So what my work has been about recently is this idea of funds of knowledge. And the idea of funds of knowledge comes from some researchers from the USA. It's really a theoretical framework, which came from a person called Louis Moll. And his idea was that everybody comes to school having experiences in the home and the community, which are learning experiences, and they bring these funds of knowledge into the school setting that teachers can use to help children's learning. But what happens for children who come from Indigenous backgrounds or children who come from other diverse cultural backgrounds is that often the teachers don't necessarily know about their funds of knowledge. And sometimes I think the learners themselves don't recognize the learning that they have at home. So my work with teachers and in terms of financial education and with children and families has been trying to help children and families recognize the experiences that they have outside of school and then helping teachers use these to develop tasks. So what I wanted to do today is share some of the data that I've collected on a recent project and also share some stories about the responses that we've had from students when we've been using financial education tasks, which are situated in mathematics learning as well. So one of the things that's really important also is that I think coming from different cultural backgrounds, we have different cultural values, and those cultural values influence how we think about money and how we think about financial situations and how we think about resources. So one of the things that I think will hopefully come clear to you when I'm sharing some of this data and the stories behind it is that for Pacific people, we have a very collectivist approach to resources. So it's not individualistic. It's not about looking after just yourself, but in fact, it's about looking after your community, looking after your family, and sharing your resources in a collective way. And I think this is really important when we're thinking about financial education, because often we frame financial education in terms of individual responsibility, or we frame children as consumers and only thinking about themselves and their own personal experiences instead of thinking about money as a collective resource, which helps, which is used to help everybody in your community. So that's kind of an important part of my work, is thinking about how these different cultural values impact on your ideas about financial resources. And like I said before, very interested and wanting to support teachers and educators to think about the student experiences and the knowledge that they're bringing into the classroom. So what I've got is a couple of photos. So one of the things that I've been working with teachers to do is giving children and family cameras and asking them to take photographs of experiences where they think that they're learning about financial experiences. So this is just one example here. I had a couple of examples on the other slide. Sorry, can you just go back to the other slide first? So these are two photographs that were shared with some of our Pacific students and families. And one of them here is a fundraising event for a church that the children were involved in. And so they shared with us, we use storytelling as well, so that connects to what Kerry was talking about, and I think Levon was touching on that as well. So we have the children bring the photograph in and then tell us the story behind the photograph. And in the top photo you can see there, that was related to a fundraising event for the church, and the children talked to us about the resources that went into preparing the food. So you can see different types of food. I'm not sure if you can see it up close enough, but they talked about making things like otai, which is like a fruit smoothie drink that we have in Pacific culture. They talked about making panakeke, which is like a Samoan donut. So they talked about the resources of making that, but with the idea that their financial experience was using their family resources to create this, but then as an act of service, they were then selling this on behalf of the church for a fundraising activity. And I think that's a really important kind of grounding to think about, that the children were not thinking about buying things for themselves, but instead they were thinking about how they could keep with their cultural values of service and reciprocity and respect, and use the financial resources they had instead to give and to help in their community. The second photograph is of what it's got a lot of different names in Pacific culture. We call it tapa cloth in Tonga, or siapo in Samoan, or masi in Fijian culture. And this is a form of bark cloth. So why I've shared this is because I think it's interesting. We'd ask the children to take photographs of financial experiences. But the child brought this in, and although it wasn't related to money because this is made from natural resources and then gifted, she saw this as really important in terms of a kind of a resource or a gift that she was given for a graduation. And what she talked about in this was not about the monetary value of it, but she talked about the labor. So the work that went into creating the tapa cloth that she was then gifted. And she talked about how many people in her family had contributed to making this. So because it's made from bark cloth, like it's a piece of bark cloth, so it's made from the bark of a tree, and it's a very long, arduous process to make it, where you scrape the bark and then you beat it into a pulp and then you lay it down to make the mat out of it, and then you use ash, and you also use different parts of leaves to paint the designs on. So you can see she saw this as being related to her financial experiences, because she knew the large amount of labor that went into making that. And I think that's a nice way to think about, for us to think about financial resources beyond simply money and transactional kinds of ways. I'll just move to the next slide now. And yeah, the last one here was this was shared by one of our children and her family who were in the project, and she was doing a dance called Ta'alonga, which is a Tongan dance. And you can see, I'm not sure if you can see it there, but she had money around that she'd been gifted during this dance. And another way that I could see the cultural values coming through in this was that she then talked about how she was gifted this money while she was doing the dance, but she then talked about how she then passed the money on to her auntie, because her auntie was the elder in the family, and then it became a family resource for the money to be used to support the family, rather than her having the money for herself and spending it on her own needs. So, or own wants, I suppose is a better way to put it. So all of these kind of show how there's this intersection between the children's experiences and their cultural values. And I hope that it provokes you as educators to think about how you can connect between children's cultural experiences, their values, and the kind of tasks that you're using in the classroom. I'll just go to the next slide. Yeah, and finally, just connecting. So that's the question I'm saying here, is asking you to think about how can we connect culture experiences and mathematics through tasks, and how can we make space for students to contribute their ideas and respond in different ways to a type of task that we use in the classroom. I wanted just to share finally with you this task that we use. So Carly Sawatsky and I have had some projects designing tasks, and our next the work we're doing at the moment will be using those photographs to design more tasks which are culturally connected. This was an example of buying fish and chips, which is a kind of everyday activity that many families do. And we had asked the children to have a look at the menu with the different types of fish and the different types of packs, and to think about the different options, giving a family scenario of how you might place these orders and what options would you choose? Would you go with a family deal 1 or family deal 2, or would you buy these packs individually? But more importantly, the second part of the question was framed to ask the children really, in their family, how might the bill be shared? So often I think we expect children to answer this in a purely mathematical way and say potentially, oh, you've got 6 people and so you divide it by 6 and everybody pays that part, which isn't really realistic in a lot of the families that we work with. So what we worked with this task in the classroom was then to say, okay, you've solved this problem, you've worked out what the options are. How would you really share this? And what's the kind of values bringing, that you're building on? So some of the children talked about things like we might share the bill where my family, the 4 of us pay, and we also pay for our grandparents because we respect our elders and we want to, and they're visitors in our home, and so we want to show our respect for them by paying for their meal as part of our family. Other children said things like, oh, our grandparents are the elders and they look after our family, so that's how they share it. So it was a nice example of getting different ideas about how financial resources are used in the family rather than just treating it like a mathematical problem and evenly divided. So I've also just got a reference there for this if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about the work we've been doing. There's an article there that you could have a look at to find out about how you might be able to use similar tasks in your classroom and support children to talk about their values and their funds of knowledge in terms of financial experiences.
Thank you so much, Jodie. That was so interesting. I love the photos. What an amazing gateway into the conversation about how students are experiencing money in all the various forms in their everyday lives. And also, I really love that you listed the values, because often we talk about values, but we don't say what those values are. So the service, reciprocity, and respect, really good to highlight those and to use that language when we are talking about money with students, I think, and how they can align their actions, decisions, saving, and all those sorts of things with their values. Really great. So thanks so much, Jodie. And for everyone, I have a little list here of some resources that I've come across in preparing for today's seminar. So there's some great links to resources in the slide pack, which you will receive. So SBS TV, that First Inventors series, is really great, especially when you're looking at resource management like fish traps, the eeling economy, land management, including bushfire management, which you can relate to sustainability in the curriculum. In that ACARA Curriculum Connections version 9, link there to the Consumer and Financial Literacy Curriculum Connections. That is actually a really great resource that ACARA have developed for version 9. And they have links for resources, and one is a really great one to the Narraganawali website, and they have a 5-minute video on that website on doing business Aboriginal way. So I think that's a really great positioning when you're being inclusive and introducing First Nations approaches to resource management in your classroom to show students that video. It's really great. In the other resources like Tax Super New and from the ATO and the Mathematics Hub, you can search for First Nations or for Indigenous or for culture and in their databases, and the resources will come up. So it's a few resources there, and thank you so much to Carrie, Livon and Jodie for sharing your stories and providing insights and those practical tips for how we as educators can embed cultural inclusivity in our work. So Moving on to our panelists on Islamic finance and looking at immigrants, it does extend this conversation to look at how different cohorts in our community do face barriers and challenges to navigating the Western financial system or the financial system in Australia. So Rosette Kerr and Laura Deswan will join us to discuss the challenges and needs of a very important migrant population. And did you know a recent report published on the ANZ Roy Morgan Financial Wellbeing Indicator found that the financial wellbeing of Australians is declining, but this is particularly acute for individuals from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And if you're not regularly looking at demographic stats or involved in demographic analysis, it might be a surprise to know that nearly a quarter of Australian households do not speak English as their first language at home, according to the 2021 census. And the proportion of households that speak a language other than English at home is growing significantly when comparing the 2021 census to the 2016 census. The top 10 languages other than English spoken at home are Mandarin, Arabic, Vietnamese, Cantonese, Punjabi, Greek, Italian, Filipino and /Tagalog, Hindi, and Spanish. And the census also tells us that the fastest growing religions in Australia are Hinduism, Islam, and Sikhism. With these cohorts, there is diversity. So you can't assume that Arabic speakers identify with Islam as their religion, as a significant portion of Arabic speakers identify with Christianity as their religion. And even when someone has been in the country for a long time, they may have low English proficiency. So we can't make any assumptions, ask questions and get to know your audience. The same as when we're approaching First Nations culture and then their needs, we need to understand what their needs are. So for those cohorts, learning about the Australian financial system can be difficult. To be able to find out about something like doing a tax return and translate that process into your own language takes time, and you need to have people you could reach out to and ask for help. It's also challenging when your religion has stringent rules that overlap with the financial system, as is a feature of Islam. So with that, I'd like to welcome Rosette to share her insights in working in an Islamic school, and she's a very active curriculum writer and creator of knowledge. She's a multiple award winner and is the Vice President of the Economics and Business Educators New South Wales. So Rosette, perhaps it's useful to tell us more about those key elements of Islamic finance and what you are doing in the classroom.
So thank you so much, Dr. Tracey, and it's been wonderful listening to all of the wonderful presentations. I'm learning a lot for sure. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the rich cultural heritage of First Nations people and acknowledge that I come to you from Dharawal country. I have a strong affinity with Indigenous people and their struggles, and I'd like to share the story of Islamic finance. So if you want to move to the next slide. So just to give you a little bit of context, so Islam is one of the 3 Abrahamic religions, so very similar to Christianity and Judaism in terms of it being based on the Abrahamic teachings and the main Gospels and books. So just to give you a little bit more context specifically to Islam, so if you want to move forward for me. So where it does differ though is we view the Quran as the final testament that was revealed, and within that testament it talks about how we shouldn't use riba, which is basically interest, as a way of doing business. Because of the inherent disadvantages that it has on the more vulnerable party. So very much about ethics and about not creating money from money, if that makes sense. So it's very much based on encouraging people to trade. And if if you learn a bit more about the stories relating to Islam, it's a lot of the culture and the religion is very entrepreneurial in its focus. So I work at an Islamic school, and I've been doing a lot of work around entrepreneurship, writing programs relating to entrepreneurship, because that's a key focus. And you know, a lot of our children come from entrepreneurial families, and that's quite central to what we do. So a lot of our personal finance information actually comes through the lens of entrepreneurship, and I'll share a bit more if you want to move forward. So if you have a look at what it means for our students or Muslim students, there are some products that we don't use, and remember that just like with any faith, there's a continuum in terms of people who are very practicing, and then those that identify as Muslim but aren't so practicing. So different people have different lenses in terms of how they view things, but generally what you find is that we won't involve ourselves as Muslims in savings accounts that pay interest. So, you know, we'll avoid that or ask for bank accounts, and some of the financial institutions are providing that now, where you can have accounts that don't earn you interest, which is counter to what a lot of the curriculum out there sort of pushes. We don't borrow using interest, or we avoid that as much as possible. Term deposits also not something that you know, is actively used. Bonds as well, because reliance on interest. There is also insurances. So this is an area that's quite grey for a lot of people. Even a lot of Muslims don't understand it too well. So you know, some people who are very practicing might say, we don't you know, participate in interest-based product, not interest-based products, insurance-based products, because you know, it's based on chance, and that's something as well, you know, that goes against our faith. So we don't gamble, as an example, that's seen as against our faith. And also, even though we strongly encourage investing, and the entire Islamic financial idea is based on investing in different companies and growing your wealth in that way to benefit everybody, there are some products that are prohibited from investing in because they harm people. So there's a lot of ethical underlying concepts within Islam and investing. So you'll see a lot of Muslim investors won't invest in things like alcohol or gambling or banking products or anything that harms people, such as, like, you know, armaments. So just next slide for me, please. So rather than focusing on what they can't do, it's really useful to focus on what they can do, and that's a way of engaging students, and also a way of teaching the content. So, for example, a key tenet of the Islamic faith is to actually pay zakat, which is a donation that you make from your surplus wealth every year. And there's a few different rules associated with it, but the idea is that when you receive wealth, it's actually a test of you and how you give back to the world, you know, in terms of sharing that wealth and really wanting for yourself what you want for your brother. So really sharing the you know, the resources around. So that's a key aspect. There are a lot of zakat calculators, and so when we teach you know, elements of financial literacy, we get students to calculate what their zakat is, and we might give some scenarios on how to do that. We also focus on what is permissible, so things like investing in shares. You know, a lot of people of Muslim faith, including myself, are avid investors in shares. Strong affinity with entrepreneurship, and I'll talk about that shortly. Budgeting, important to everybody. Superannuation, but with a lens of avoiding products that aren't ethical or that go against our faith. Really, we should all be understanding taxation and anything else relating to financial literacy. So most things are on the table, or you might want to rethink some things. It's really important that you give students voice and choice, I find, when teaching financial literacy. So really it's a personal thing. So you might give an inquiry-based activity where you give an option to really think about their ethical standing, or their their cultural or religious values when exploring financial literacy. I also find it's really important, and this is something that I experienced growing up, having really inclusive and positive language around financial literacy. There's a lot of stigma, unfortunately, associated with Islam, and I think most of it is actually lack of knowledge, and very one-sided knowledge, and not understanding that by showing your caring and inclusive nature, then really you're allowing students to be themselves and to really celebrate who they are and celebrating diversity. So even if you're creating a worksheet, it is okay to use a name that is not typically common in Australian culture, so that we're celebrating diversity in different ways, and even in some of the things that we do cover. So for example, I know when I did my work with the ASX, I created a worksheet that was about celebrating leaders of the ASX that were of Indigenous heritage. So doing the same thing, essentially, maybe if you're doing some learning regarding Islamic personal finance. Just with the next slide, just quickly, focusing on investment instead of interest. So when you're talking about compounding, I find a lot of financial literacy curriculum or resources are really focused on compounding interest to make money and grow wealth, rather focusing on investing from the beginning and compounding, investment wealth. I think that that's really important. Next slide, please. So I did complete quite a bit of research in the area of financial literacy for Muslim students recently, and this is being published in about 10 days' time. So it's unfortunate I can't share it now, but I did undertake some research on behalf of the University of South Australia around rethinking how and what is taught as financial literacy in schools. I did focus more on Islamic school systems, but they are also applicable across all areas. So I'll share that with Ecstra Foundation once that's released. Next slide, please. So some of the key findings, we've got close to 1 million people that identify as Muslim in Australia. So if you're in a school that does have Muslim students, please be inclusive, especially if there are a lot of students of Muslim faith, but also understand the diversity within that. It's really important to long-term well-being. I think we all agree about that, and really think about the curriculum you create at your school to allow for that. Next one, please. At my school, a few different projects that I've worked on, and at my school, I'm very grateful, is probably a leader in this space, and I've written a couple of programs around financial literacy over the years. One is to do with Khadija, who was the greatest entrepreneur of all time. She's probably, if you were to equate how wealthy she was at the time with some of our billionaires, she'd probably rival them. And she did business in a very ethical way. And that's something that we explore as part of this PBL unit. Also, I created a unit a few years ago that taught about the Australian financial system, and then paralleled it to the Islamic finance system, and so students could see and understand the two different systems, and there was a lot of skill-based elements within that. And then one other school has done something around this space, but really there's not much out there. So it's really dependent on teachers actively trying to good in that area and push for that. Just the next slide. Sources of additional learning. These are the three main organisations that I deal with and learn from as part of Islamic finance. So the Centre for Islamic Thought and Education is probably the leader in this space. And then we've got the Australian Centre for Islamic Finance, which just gives lots of information on Islamic finance, but not education based. And then Ecstra, which is Islamic Science and Research Academy of Australia, which is tied to Charles Sturt University. And they also have a lot of knowledge as well that they share. And I sometimes run courses on their behalf around financial literacy. And then finally, references, I've included those if you want to have a look at them. If you'd like to connect or if you need help, I'm more than happy to help. I've put my QR code there. Please connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to share my knowledge and ideas if you'd like. So thank you very much.
Wow, Rosette, that was amazing. I learned so much in that short period of time, especially about the focus on entrepreneurship and how we need to look at investing as the focus rather than interest. So that was really interesting. And I might have a follow-up question about budgeting and how we can go about budgeting exercises that reflect all these different cultures. Might be actually a good challenge to do a little bit of a worksheet on that. But anyway, I'd like to introduce Laura to the conversation. So Laura is a senior lecturer at Queensland University of Technology, and her research focuses on financial equality and improving outcomes for those that are disadvantaged by current structures, particularly young women and those from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Laura, can you tell us more about you, your work, and the challenges people from linguistically diverse backgrounds face?
Thanks, Tracey. So as Tracey mentioned, I'm a senior lecturer at QUT, and I've done a lot of sort of research in financial literacy. And at the moment, we're focusing on a project looking at young adults from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds who are living in Australia. I'll start off with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners at QUT, like the one I'm coming to you from the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara, and we acknowledge them as the First Nations owners of the lands where QUT sits, and recognise that this has always been places of teaching, research and learning. So as a little bit of background to this project, Tracey and I have worked together before on a research project which was funded by the Financial Basics Foundation, where we actually went into high schools and talked to young students ages 14 to 18 and just wanted to find out what they know about money. And there were a couple of findings that came out of that were really important. And again, these aren't necessarily new for educators. I think a lot of them you're already aware of, but we hadn't really looked at them in terms of financial concepts or teaching those financial concepts. And it's really about the impact of home life. So just as an example, we looked at young students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and their context brings a lot to how they interpret what you're talking about. So if we're talking about debt to kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they might think of things that we would term bad debt, credit cards, afterpay, borrowing from friends and family. If you're talking to kids from higher socioeconomic backgrounds, then they're probably going to connect it with mortgages, maybe investing. And as we just heard from Rosette, if you talk to kids from Islamic faith, then they're probably not going to engage with that at all. So it really is important to consider those different backgrounds. We can probably go to the next slide, Tracey. So a little bit of how this project came about. The Financial Basics Foundation is again funding this research. They've recognised as part of their mission that they want to improve education resources for all young adults in Australia. And Australia does have a very large migrant population. So Tracey gave some statistics earlier, but around 30% of Australians were born overseas, which is huge. And increasingly, they're coming from non-English speaking countries. So India is now one of the largest groups of people migrating to Australia. We do also have some worrying statistics around that. So we know that immigrants have about a 30% retirement saving gap. We talk about the gender gap in super, but we also have one for immigrants, and that can quite easily be traced to just how complex our system is, even for people born and raised in Australia to understand. So then you have immigrants coming in, and there's all sorts of barriers there. We also know that international students, we have this perception that they're usually quite wealthy, but around 60% of them will experience high levels of financial stress while they're in Australia studying. So generally, there's a lack of research in this area, looking particularly at immigrants in Australia and how we can sort of help develop education resources for them. Next slide, please, Trace. All right, so our research project, we've had a couple of stages. It's still ongoing. So we have completed an interview stage. We are currently trying to collect these videos from our participants, and you can see some of our lovely participants on the screen there, and they have all consented to their images being used. So they tell us their stories, and so we are trying to use that story-based approach to collecting data here. Next slide, please. And this is really the model we're working with. So we understand that our financial knowledge and what we're capable of comes from all of these different influences, and culture really does influence quite a lot of those. So you can see that's going to impact on your attitudes, your behaviours, your environment, your knowledge, and then also access to information. So if you are a new immigrant to Australia, or if there's language barriers or even contextual barriers, like what Rosette was talking about as well, that's going to impact on your ability to access information to help you. Next slide. Okay, so I'm flying through this, I'm aware of the time. I can share with you some of the insights that we've got. So again, the research is ongoing, but there are some interesting bits of information coming out. So spending habits is one of them. So we've had observations, and we're looking particularly at people who are from African, Middle Eastern and broader Asia backgrounds, aged 18 to 24. And a lot of them have made the observation that young people in Australia seem to spend almost for the sake of spending. And it kind of makes sense when you think in Australia we have more of that capitalism approach, where we do sort of spend and stimulate the economy, and that could actually be a bit of a culture shock when you're coming from countries or cultures that don't focus on that. Religion obviously has a big impact for different types of religions and how they value money and the ways that they deal with money. Financial socialisation as well, that we had comments from a lot of our participants about how in Australia they witness their friends being kind of financially socialised to make them independent from the parents. So we're trying to bring them up to be financially independent. We're trying to get them to go out into the world on their own, and that's actually not what's done in their culture. They're more likely to have that collectivist approach. Language barriers is definitely an issue. So that comes up with, it's understanding terms, but then having to understand those more complex terms, which we're talking about, things like compounding, interest and so on. It's another barrier there with trying to understand, so it might be very unfamiliar. There's differences in the financial systems, of course, so that's another barrier that they have to learn and understand those sometimes from scratch. They can be quite different. And one of the participants was telling me about how they were scammed with paying for their ATO bill with Apple gift cards. And so for somebody who's grown up in Australia, you'd probably think that's not how the ATO functions, but they just don't know how the ATO functions. Current currency barriers is another one. So having to convert Australian dollars into their own currency to be able to understand the value of something or what it's worth. And then the last one, there's susceptibility to scams. So that just comes out of all of those previous points. So practical implications, look, I think you've already heard so many wonderful examples of how this can be improved. And I think it just goes to show that when you try and improve for one group, you often end up improving for everyone. So having more open ways of thinking about how people experience finances is going to improve for everybody. So keeping learning activities and assessments relevant to their particular context. Avoid using complicated language. So we had feedback that simple language is better than translations. So they do actually want to know the English words for things and to learn them, but to try and keep it really simple. And then, yeah, just use some collective finance examples or problems as an approach to just broadening perspectives. And so, yeah, it can benefit everyone.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think that's a really nice round out to our discussion today, and really interesting to know that they like simple words in English to help them explain, to help them understand financial system and processes they need to engage in. I actually did find it difficult to find resources on this to help teachers. Money Smart are translating their resources, so that's in 10 languages, but as Laura just revealed in her study there, perhaps it's the language, the simplification of the English language we need to look at. And lawyers, if you're listening, there's a lot of work you guys can do in financial contracts, rental agreements, all those sorts of things that people engage with on a day-to-day basis. So thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much, Rosette, for that. Now, due to my very poor time management, we are left with a little bit of time for questions at the end. And so if I can get everyone, welcome back to the screen. Please, participants, put your questions in the chat there. And I have one here for you all. Well, from a Western perspective, a core pillar to financial security is having a financial buffer to cover unexpected expenses. Is this something that is applicable to Indigenous cultures? And if so, how would that be taught to Indigenous people? So that's savings buffer. Does anyone have any strategies to help with that?
I think in the Pacific, that it's about resource management, not necessarily a financial buffer. Oops, my camera's just gone off for some weird reason.
We can still hear you, Jodie.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened there. Yeah, so I think it's about, yeah, the kind of resource management of how you collectively share resources, but also maintain the resources. And so I do think that that is something that can be taught to children. And I mean, it's applicable to money as well, but also thinking wider about resource management. So if that's helpful.
Yeah.
I can think of an example from growing up on my dad's side of the family. When my grandma perhaps needed, say, a new fridge or some sort of appliance, it was all the siblings would realize it was their responsibility to help out. So they would figure out a way to come up with that money and buy the appliance for their mother. So it wasn't necessarily that my grandmother had to have that buffer or that extra resources. She knew that her kids would step in and look out for her. And I think that is a bit of that the cultural way of looking after your elders. And if you do have extra resources, helping out when you can.
Navon, I think that's a great segue into when we're doing budgeting exercises in the classroom, how we can bring up these particular items that students might want to include in their budgets, like saving to help extended family, like having a savings plan to contribute to funeral expenses or weddings, or as well as rainy day savings. Do you think it's better to actually put those line items in the budgets when we're teaching it?
I guess just speaking from my experience as a child, I was never asked to contribute. It was more of an adult thing. So I just don't know that example may not be age appropriate. That's my thinking. But if you were working with adults, I think it would be. I'm just not sure in the high school setting if that would be appropriate.
Yeah, with the Pacific community, one of the interesting things was that the children took quite a lot of times, they took photos of the gifts that their parents were giving. So I think the children do have some knowledge of this. So there was examples of the children taking gifts of money that was given for graduation, given for school, like on behalf of the family, given for funeral costs. And they would talk about how their parents, so yeah, not themselves, but they talked about how their parents had put this money aside for family obligations. So there is a connection there, I think. Yeah, but I agree with you, Levon, in terms of it's not necessarily the child's, but it was more seen as a kind of family responsibility.
Yeah, I think that even just making it about if it's their pocket money, you know, you could probably teach them how to budget there. And I think for me, knowing about how a lot of people like our mob out on remote communities, we talk about sustainability of knowing about our resources to feed and you know, obviously fishing and making sure everyone's got everything that's there. We can talk about how we do it as a community. So rather than it being for a business per se, you could give them the examples of some of the traditional, you know, things that we did in making sure that we had food and resources that were able to be there for the next season.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kerry. And I really like the future planning aspect of this, so that you are planning for next year's seasonal harvest, but not only next year's seasonal harvest, but a decade in advance in the way that you manage the land, you manage the fish traps or the eeling economy, whatever it is. There's a lot of long-term future planning that goes into this resource management, which I think we can do better to appreciate those approaches in Western society, particularly with a lack of delayed gratification and spending and buying everything now. There are a lot of great comments in the chat that they learned so much. They like the idea of stories, but no questions in there at the moment. And look, I have a million questions, but I think we are going to wrap it up because we are at time, or bit over time now. So I'd like to bring this webinar to a close. Unfortunately, we'll have to do it again another day. It's been great to see such a significant interest in this topic. Thank you for coming along this evening and being a part of this community of financial educators who care about developing financial capabilities of young people. Your participation is highly appreciated. And I'd like to ask you to join me in extending a heartfelt thank you to the speakers today who shared their expertise and provided thoughtful insights and practical tips, and who have inspired us to continue on this journey of inclusive financial education. So feel free to drop in the chat potential topic ideas for future webinars. We will be sending you via email links to the recording, the slide deck, and let us know if you need a certificate of participation. You can subscribe to the Talk Money website, contact me directly, and keep up to date with the news and events with Talk Money with Ecstra Foundation or Ecstra Foundation itself. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Hope everyone has a great evening.
Thanks, Tracey. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.